We're told regularly by the progressive left and by the media that there's a war being waged against people of color in this country. We're told that there's been a war waged against them for the last 400 years, going back to Jamestown. But setting history aside, let's talk about today, because today we're facing a variety of incidents going on in our streets. Is there a war being waged against people of color today, right now, as I'm recording this? And if so, who's waging it? Now, often in discussions on social media or face-to-face, somebody will say Donald Trump's a racist. And I'll ask for an example. Give me an example. And usually examples I get are, he used the Wuhan or China virus to talk about COVID-19. He's building a wall to keep out Hispanics. You have a Muslim travel ban. And these are the examples that are given. And then, you can ask, well, are Muslims the ones in the street doing the protesting and the looting and the rioting? No. Are East Asians out in the streets? So you have Chinese attacking railroads because they were exploited as railroad labor back in the 19th century? No. Do you see Hispanics out there in large numbers looting and rioting, committing arson? No. Well, who is doing the looting, the rioting, the arson? African Americans. And in many cases, whites. In some cases, more whites than African Americans. How are these people exploited? What has Trump done to them? What has Trump, now we know what Trump's done to whites. He drives them nuts and they all suffer from Trump derangement syndrome. But what about African Americans? What has Donald Trump done during his years as president, specifically to African Americans? And I usually, well, he said this or he said that, but I don't get anything as specific as if you ask about what he's done to other people of color. It's all kind of vague about what he's done. Well, he's a racist. He says racist things. Okay, but specifics, and you don't get them. So why is it that of the groups that are hardest to pin down with relationship to Donald Trump's alleged racism, aren't these other groups out in the street? Which leads me to my question. Is there in fact a war being waged against African Americans? And the related question is, if there is, who's waging it? I would argue that there is a war being waged against African Americans today. And you could argue there has been for 400 years. But who's waging it? And I would argue it's not Donald Trump. It's not the Republican Party. It's actually the Democrats and the progressive left. They're the ones who have been waging war against African Americans for the last 400 years, and they're still doing it today. Now, what are some obvious examples? Well, we'll skip the history in this video. I've already talked about that before. I'll talk about slavery and Jim Crow and all those things, the KKK, all products of the Democrat Party. Segregation, separate but equal, all the Democrat Party. Let's focus on just what's happening recently. And let's look at several issues. Let's start with the issue, very divisive issue, but a very critical issue, abortion. Yep, I said it, abortion. We're going to talk about abortion. We always hear, with regard to slavery, that slavery was inconsistent with the principles spelled out in the Declaration of Independence. The idea that all men are created equal. We didn't live up to that. We didn't live up to that ideal in the Declaration of Independence when we set up the United States under the Constitution, which we still operate under today. But there's something else that's said in the Declaration, which is inconsistent with things that are going on not 100 years ago, but today. And that's abortion. When do you get the right to life in the Declaration of Independence? Does it say we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are born equal? No. It says when they're created equal. When are human beings created? Now, some people might argue conception. Others would argue maybe not. There's the old idea, common to some extent in the centuries ago, of ensoulment. At what point does the fetus get a soul? At what point does God stick a soul into this mass? Again, some people would say conception. Others would argue not. Might be fetal heartbeat or something later. We could debate that politically, come up with a policy. But what's the Democrats' position on when you get your right to life? You get it when you're born. If you manage to survive a late-term abortion, you might still not get it. They may kill you on the table after you're born. Now, I would argue that that is inherently inconsistent with the ideas spelled out in the Declaration of Independence. It's as inconsistent with those ideals as slavery was with those ideals. We've outlawed slavery. We've actually made abortion legal during my lifetime. Now, what does this have to do with the war on African Americans? Everything. African Americans make up about 13% of the population. 13%. Hispanics are around 13%. The numbers vary depending on the estimates. But they're both around 13%. That's 26% of the U.S. population are black and brown. Black and brown fetuses represent about 53% of all abortions in this country. Blacks are 13% of the population, 28% of those aborted. Now, there's a term used in federal policy. You often hear it referenced with efforts to prove that there's discrimination, racism. It's called disparate impact. We're seeing it now with COVID-19. Lots of people are dying from COVID-19. But although blacks are 13% of the population, more than 13% of the people dead are African Americans. That's disparate impact. That disparate impact is evidence of racism in our society. Disparate impact. Keep that term in mind. Now, what would you call abortion? If blacks are 13% of the population and 28% of all the babies aborted, or fetuses aborted if you prefer, how is that not disparate impact? Why is it that whites are 71% of the population, but they're not 71% of the fetuses aborted? Whites are 39% of the fetuses aborted. In other words, they're underrepresented among aborted children. Why isn't this disparate impact considered racism? Why isn't Democrat abortion policy, pro-abortion policy, which is obviously aborting more black children than white children, considerably more, twice as many almost, considered evidence, prima facie evidence of racism? Imagine if it was the Republicans who were the pro-abortion policy. And imagine that their abortion policies were killing 28% of black babies when it should only be 13%. The Republicans would be branded as a racist. And these statistics would be thrown up as evidence of disparate impact and Republican racism. But it's the Democrats who are pursuing these policies. It's the Republicans who oppose them. So if there's a war on blacks, when does Black life start? Black lives matter. Black lives matter in the womb. That's where life starts. And abortion policy in this country is inconsistent with a Declaration of Independence. And the way it's currently practiced, the way it currently operates, represents disparate impact against the African American community. But it's not racist because why? Because progressives are pushing it, because the Democrats are pushing it. It's their official policy. So that can't be racist. Just as being the party that's responsible for slavery and the Civil War, which was an attempt to defend slavery, is the responsibility of the Democrats, but they're not held accountable for it today. I mean, if I owned a company that did something with slave owners in the South, I would be in trouble. If they could find something in my family tree that I was somehow connected to racism, which they can't because we weren't even here, they would be looking for that. But what about the family tree of the Democrat Party? Founded by Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner. How come they're never connected to any of this? Again, as I said, if there's a war against African Americans in this country, the people waging it are on the left, not in the White House, at least not yet. And don't think for a moment that there aren't African Americans in this country who don't see this, who don't recognize this, who don't understand this, because they do.
Everybody's talking about being woke. Woke! Woke! And you didn't know that Margaret Sanger? You didn't know that Margaret Sanger said this? We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. Now, this was written in 1939. So how are you going to be woke? How are you going to be a woke church and don't know this? This is old. This is old. You bishops and pastors and leaders out there, if you haven't told your congregation about the number one killer of African Americans, an organization that kills more African Americans every 2 weeks than the Klan did in its entire history, you are not qualified to use the word woke. You're asleep at the wheel. Now, Hillary Clinton did when she received the Margaret Sanger Award. Hillary Clinton did say, I admire Margaret Sanger. Enormously, not a little bit. Enormously. That's right. All y'all who are taking pictures, that's fine. Come on, you can get them. She did. These are her words. They're not my words. You know what? I would have never. There's no politician, Republican nor Democrat. See, I'm an independent. No politician would get my vote nor my support if they would have said, I admire Margaret Sanger. The woman who said, our goal is the extermination of the Negro race. What kind of Negro would vote for a woman who would say such a thing? Got to be a dumb Negro to do that.
What about our cities? The cities where all these riots and protests and arson and looting are taking place. Who runs these cities? Democrats. Where I grew up in Philadelphia, I'm 68 years old. I think that I had a Republican mayor somewhere in my first 12 months. That's about it. My entire life, the city's been run by Democrats. The city council, Democrats. If there are problems in Philadelphia, who's responsible? Donald Trump? The same's true of Chicago, Seattle, and Portland. Atlanta hasn't had a Republican mayor since the 19th century. They haven't even had a white Democrat as mayor since the 1970s. But Donald Trump and Republicans are responsible for the situation in Atlanta and Detroit. How can that be? If somebody's waging war against African Americans in these urban areas with governmental policies, it sure, to me, looks like it's the Democrats. What about education in this country? Blacks do get a raw deal. They're horrible schools. They're being failed by the school systems in these cities. But again, who runs the cities? Republicans? Which party is connected to the teachers who run these school districts? The Democrats. The teacher unions are all in cahoots with the Democrats. So you have urban areas and cities run by Democrats. You have school systems in these urban areas run by Democrats for decades. Decade after decade after decade. You have the teacher unions who donate all kinds of money to the Democrats, which they've been doing for decades. And we're going to blame Donald Trump and the Republicans for the fact that African Americans are getting crappy educations. Which party wants charter schools? Which party wants more vouchers to give African American children the opportunity to go to different schools? Is it the Democrats? No, it's the Republicans. It's Donald Trump. Clear evidence of his racism. He wants to undermine the public schools in the system, in the city, as if they haven't already been undermined and run into the ground in many of these cities by the administrators and the teachers unions and the Democrats who run the cities and run these school districts. Again, if there's a war being waged against African Americans in this country, who's waging it? Donald Trump or the Democrats? What about security in these cities? Who wants to improve security in the cities? It's not the Democrats. Their answer to improving security in the cities is to defund the police. Poll after poll after poll shows that African Americans don't want to see the police defunded. They would like to see the police improved. They would like to see the police better trained, given psychological screenings and things like that. That's all understandable. Who wouldn't? Who would disagree with that? But that doesn't mean they don't want to see cops on their streets. Now, obviously, Black Lives Matter wants to see the police defunded and eliminated. And we've seen the police back off in city after city to avoid escalating the situation, to avoid tangling with the protesters. And what have we seen as a result of that? Better security? Remember in Portland when they said if just the federal troops would go away from the courthouse, everything would be hunky-dory? And the federal forces did leave the courthouse, and the state troopers came in for a couple of days. And sure enough, the protesters moved away. But where did they move? They moved north, and they moved east. They went up into the north part of Portland, and the eastern part of Portland, and they started doing all the stuff there, attacking other buildings, attacking government buildings, county buildings, city buildings, the police union hall or whatever it's called there. They just moved, and then they went into some neighborhoods and started harassing people there. So getting rid of the federal forces didn't bring peace and tranquility to the streets of Portland. Sure as hell didn't. Anything, it's gotten worse. At least before it was all focused on the courthouse area. Now it's spreading around the city and into the suburbs. Is this, what's happening in Kenosha, doing anything for the African American community there? There's about 100,000 people in Kenosha. About 10% are African American. I doubt that most of those people out there, white or black, are from Kenosha. They're coming in from Milwaukee. They're coming in Chicago. Not just the protesters, not just the rioters and the looters. Last night we had these self-described militia units coming in from other places, from other states. I think the guy they just arrested for shooting two people, one of them I think died or was killed, is from Illinois. White militia guy came with a gun, ends up shooting two protesters, two rioters. They're not even from the same state. And I'm sure the same is true on the other groups. People are funneling all this into Kenosha, which has become a battleground. And the poor people of Kenosha are suffering. The reports today that I've seen, this business community that was trashed in Kenosha was largely black-owned businesses are being destroyed. And the same thing happened where I lived back in the earlier riots. I mean, there were 4 places within 10 minutes of me that were trashed in the protests that occurred here. They were burned down and looted. Of the 4, only 1 was white owned. It was a sporting goods store, think sneakers, think $300 Nike apparel, that kind of stuff. That went. A Hindu-owned jewelry store went. A Vietnamese restaurant went. And a gas station owned by a Bangladeshi Muslim couple went. Do you see a pattern here? I mean, whose store got trashed in the local riots here? Tampa, Florida. 3 out of 4 places that got trashed near me were owned by Asians, who the last I heard were people of color. So when the police backed off here, who suffered? White people? No. They didn't trash Busch Gardens, which is a couple blocks away from all the action. They didn't go there. No, they went after a Hindu-owned jewelry store, a Vietnamese restaurant, and the Bangladeshi gas station. But it's a chain that owned a sporting goods store. So it was local merchants of color, who lost their livelihoods. Oh, yeah, I know they're all covered by insurance. One can hope. But they're still going to be closed down. And on top of COVID, some of these places may never reopen. And that's a story all across America. But this is all part of a war on African Americans being waged by Donald Trump? Really? You believe that? So there is a war being waged on African Americans in this country. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But it's not being waged by Donald Trump. Donald Trump isn't the one pushing the abortion of African American babies. Donald Trump is not the one running these cities, nor the Republican Party. Donald Trump does not control the school boards and the teacher unions in these cities that are not preparing these kids for an educated future. Donald Trump's not the one who's pulling back police and security forces so that there's no confrontation with the rioters. That's the local Democrats who are making those decisions. Donald Trump isn't the one calling to defund the police and to trust social workers and psychologists to defend these urban areas with their high crime rates. None of that's Donald Trump. During the period of lynching in this country, from the period after the Civil War up until about the 1960s, about 3,500 African Americans were lynched. I mean, the number is not exact. You'll see exact numbers, but there's still estimates. I'm sure people were lynched we will never know about. 8,000 people have been shot and killed in Chicago. Just Chicago. Remember, the lynching numbers for the entire country. East Coast, the West Coast, when you put in the Chinese and Mexicans and Indians, most of them were out in the West. Lynchings of people, with total people, black and non-black, there were over 5,000. Over about a century, across the nation. 8,000 people, mostly black, overwhelmingly black, have been murdered just in the city of Chicago in the last 20 years. Black lives matter, but not theirs. 8,000 people since 2000 just in Chicago. More people have been killed in the city of Chicago since 2000, more black people, than were lynched over the course of a century in the entire nation. So when we talk about a war being waged against African Americans in this country, I think there is one. But the problem is, it's not Donald Trump who's waging it. It's not Donald Trump supporters like me who's causing it. I'm not for abortion policies. I'm not for supporting the schools and not having charter schools or offering kids vouchers to go to other schools, private schools, wherever they choose to go. I'm for those things. Most Republicans are for those things. my party hasn't been running the cities of America for the last 50 to 100 years. So there is a war being waged against blacks. That's true. It's not coming from Donald Trump. So what do you think? You think there's a war being waged against African Americans? And if there is, who's waging it? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Let me know in the comments. And if you can, subscribe to the channel and support it. Hit the thumbs up button, hit the notification button so you know when I post new videos. Share it with your friends. And until the next time, keep fighting.